The candle had burned to its last half-inch before Julie finally set down her needle. She held the gown at arm's length, ivory silk, seed pearls along the neckline. A tear along the left seam so fine that only she would ever know it had existed. It was Vivienne's, naturally. Vivienne was careless with beautiful things because she had always had enough of them to afford carelessness. Julie pressed the seam between her fingers, checked the tension of every stitch, and then hung the gown carefully on the hook beside the window as though it were her own. It was not her own. Nothing in Asheford Manor was. She had understood this since she was 9 years old, standing in the doorway of her father's study while Lady Hartwell, still warm from the wedding, still performing kindness, explained with a patient smile that the East Wing bedroom would need to be repurposed, that Julie would be more comfortable in the smaller room near the servants' stair, that it would feel like an adventure. Julie had looked at the woman her father had married 6 weeks after her mother's grave had settled, and she had understood with the particular clarity that lonely children develop that comfort was not the point. She had nodded. She had moved her things herself. That was 11 years ago. She was 20 now, and the room near the servants' stair had become simply her room, small, yes, with a window that fogged in winter and a floorboard that lifted near the foot of the bed, but hers in the only way anything can belong to someone with no legal claim to anything, through sheer daily occupation. The manor itself was handsome in the way of neglected things, good bones, faded surface. Lord Voss had left behind debts that Lady Hartwell had spent a decade artfully concealing from the social circles she refused to abandon. The East Wing leaked. The portrait gallery had been quietly sold off, painting by painting, and replaced with mirrors to suggest abundance rather than admit its absence. Julie managed the household accounts. She knew, to the penny, how little was left. She did not say so. She was furniture that occasionally spoke, and furniture does not volunteer financial assessments. The announcement came at breakfast, delivered by Lady Hartwell with the practiced theatricality of a woman who had spent 40 years treating every room as a stage. "Ravenswood's ball," she said, setting the invitation card beside the toast rack as though it were a holy relic. "Both of you." She looked at Cecilia and Vivienne. She did not look at Julie. "We have been waiting 3 seasons for this. I will not have it wasted." Cecilia, 22, dark-haired, with eyes that were always calculating the distance between where she stood and where she wished to be, picked up the card and read it twice. "The Duke never opens his season ball to families below the first tier," she said. "Someone spoke for us." "I have been cultivating Lady Pemberton's goodwill for 18 months, Lady Hartwell replied. "Goodwill does not cultivate itself." Vivienne, who was prettier than her sister and considerably less interested in strategy, was already thinking about the dress. Julie was already thinking about the dress too, specifically, whether the alterations Vivienne would inevitably request at the last possible moment would require her to work through the night again, or simply until 2 in the morning. "Julie," Lady Hartwell addressed her at last, the way one addresses a household schedule. "You will remain home the evening of the ball to prepare for their return. Warm the parlor. Have supper ready." "Yes, ma'am." No one noted the absence of an invitation. It had always been thus. The remarkable thing was not that Julie was excluded. It was how smoothly the exclusion was performed, so integrated into the rhythm of daily life that it no longer required acknowledgement from anyone, including Julie herself. She went, that afternoon, to the loose floorboard at the foot of her bed. The box beneath it was small, dark wood, brass hinges gone green with age. Inside, her mother's letters, tied with ribbon so old it had stiffened into a permanent crease, a locket on a fine chain, and at the bottom, a folded document sealed with wax she had never broken, in an envelope addressed in her mother's handwriting to no one, or perhaps to a future version of her daughter that her mother had hoped, against reason, she would eventually become. Julie picked it up, set it back down, picked it up again. She had done this perhaps 30 times in 3 years. Each time something stopped her, not fear exactly, but a bone-deep instinct that certain knowledge, once obtained, cannot be set aside. That there is a particular grief in discovering you were owed something that was never given. She put it back, closed the box, replaced the floorboard. The night of the ball arrived with cold rain and a broken carriage wheel. She was helping the driver assess the damage, holding the lantern while he crouched in the mud examining the axle, when the situation became, through a series of events she would later describe to herself as entirely nobody's fault, irreversible. The trunks needed delivering. The driver needed assistance. The road to Ravenswood's estate was only a mile further, and Julie knew the way. She was wearing her traveling cloak over the gown she had spent 3 evenings repairing so carefully that the silk moved as though it had never known a single flaw. She had not planned this. She was not the sort of woman who planned bold gestures. She was the sort of woman who managed consequences, and consequences had simply, this once, pushed her through a gate she had not intended to enter. The servants' corridor was warm and quiet. The sounds of the ball pulsed distantly, strings, laughter, the low roar of assembled society performing itself. She turned a corner. A man stood at the window at the end of the hall, alone, his back to her, looking out at the dark gardens below. He turned at the sound of her step. They looked at each other. "You're hiding too," Julie said, before she could think better of it. The man, tall, dark-coated, with the kind of stillness that comes not from calm but from long practice at containing something larger, looked at her for a moment. Then, very quietly, he smiled. 11 minutes, he said. "You found me with 4 to spare." Jack Marston did not chase. This was a known fact about him, known by his solicitors, his household staff, his mother before she died, and every matchmaking matron in London who had spent 3 consecutive seasons arranging elaborate social geometries designed to place him in rooms with suitable women. He did not chase. He assessed, he considered, and occasionally, when something proved genuinely worthy of his attention, he moved toward it with the quiet deliberateness of a man who had learned that urgency is usually just panic wearing better clothes. He thought about the woman in the corridor every day for 2 weeks. He made discreet inquiries, a word to his steward, a careful question to the Pemberton household, a review of the guest registry that should have contained every name present that evening. Nothing. She appeared in none of it. She had walked through his ball like a rumor and dissolved just as cleanly, and the absence of her was somehow louder than the presence of every other person he had spoken to that night. He attended 3 more social events with what his secretary privately described as uncharacteristic attentiveness. He scanned every room. He found no one. Meanwhile, Asheford Manor had entered its season of triumph. Lady Hartwell's maneuvering, 18 months of careful social cultivation, a loan she could not afford from a cousin she liked even less, had produced results that exceeded even her considerable expectations. Within 6 weeks of Ravenswood's ball, Cecilia was formally engaged to the Earl of Stonebridge, a severe and wealthy man who admired her composure and had not yet discovered what lay beneath it. Vivienne was promised to the Earl's younger brother, Viscount Alderley, who was amiable, handsome, and almost entirely without opinion. 2 daughters, 2 titles. The house smelled of celebration for an entire fortnight. Julie sewed both trousseaux. She worked through 4 consecutive nights on Cecilia's traveling gown alone, a deep burgundy wool with jet buttons that needed to be individually secured, each one an argument against haste. She did not complain. She did not, when Vivienne changed her mind about the lace trim on 3 separate occasions, say a single word beyond "of course." She moved through the Manor's excitement like a draft, present in every room, noticed by no one, responsible for more than anyone acknowledged. On the 5th night, her hands shaking slightly from fatigue, she went to the floorboard. She opened the sealed letter. She read it once quickly, as though speed might reduce the impact. Then she sat down on the floor of her small room and read it again slowly, the way you read something that is rearranging the furniture of everything you thought you knew. It was a legal attestation, formal, witnessed, signed by 2 solicitors whose names she did not recognize but whose seals were precise and unambiguous. Her father, Lord Voss, had filed a document of heirship on her behalf 14 months before his death. He had named her. He had been specific, and Lady Hartwell, who had arrived at the estate within weeks of the funeral carrying her own solicitor and her 2 daughters and an inventory list, had ensured it was never mentioned again. Julie sat with the document for a long time. She did not weep. She was 20 years old and had taught herself, through years of careful practice, to process grief in very small increments, enough to function, never enough to flood. She folded the paper. She placed it back in the box. She did not yet know what to do with a truth this size, but she understood with sudden and total clarity that she was no longer holding nothing. She was holding something. She simply had to decide when. The charity exhibition at Pemberton House was held on a Thursday afternoon in early April, a progressive gesture by its hostess, open across social tiers, dedicated to literary and artistic works. Julie attended as a helper, arranging books, carrying display boards, moving quietly through the room in the way she had always moved through rooms that were not quite hers. Jack attended as a patron. They saw each other across a long table covered in manuscripts. The recognition was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was the particular stillness of 2 people who have been looking for something without admitting it, suddenly finding it in an unremarkable moment. He went still. She looked up. Neither spoke for 3 full seconds. Then he walked to her side of the table and picked up a novel she had just set down and said, without preamble, "You've read this." "3 times," she said. "I've told no one I've read it once. It isn't considered appropriate reading for a man of my position." "It isn't considered appropriate reading for someone of mine either," she said, "though for different reasons." He looked at her steadily. "You didn't tell me your name. You didn't tell me yours." A pause. "Jack," he said. "Julie," she said. They spent 2 hours at that table. They talked about the novel, its arguments, its failures, its one extraordinary chapter that neither of them could adequately explain but both had returned to repeatedly. They talked about what it means to love something quietly in private because the public version of your life has no room for it. She forgot, for most of those 2 hours, to be careful. When they parted, she found his program on the table. On the back, in small, deliberate handwriting, "Same time, same garden, 3 evenings hence." She went all 3 evenings. The walled garden behind his London townhouse backed against a public lane, accessible, unobtrusive, requiring no invitation through any formal door. She told herself this was practical. She went the first evening out of curiosity. She went the second because the first had undone something in her she hadn't known was wound so tightly. She went the third because by then she understood she was making a choice and she made it anyway. They talked about loss, about duty, about the strange loneliness of being surrounded by people who see only your function. On the 3rd evening, beneath a sky going purple at its edges, he took her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, slowly, deliberately, with the gravity of a man not given to careless gestures. She walked home in the dark. She did not look back. She was afraid that if she did, she would return. Cecilia had followed her, not all 3 evenings, only the 3rd, suspicious enough by then to spend an hour waiting in a hired carriage at the lane's entrance. She saw what she needed to see. She did not hear a single word, but she saw the garden, the 2 figures, the hand-kiss. The next morning was quiet and surgical. Lady Hartwell did not raise her voice. She never did. She sat across from Julie in the morning room with her hands folded and dismantled everything with the precision of someone who had been preparing for this possibility and found it on arrival almost convenient. "You have nothing," she said. "You are nothing that he would recognize in daylight. And if you breathe a word about that document, if you produce it, show it, whisper it to a single soul, I will have you named a forger before the week is out. I have the social standing to make it believed. You have nothing to make it doubted." Julie looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood and left the room and went upstairs. She wrote the note first. "Please do not look for me." She addressed it to Jack and sent it with the morning post before she could reconsider. Then she opened her wardrobe and took out the single bag she owned, already half-packed. She realized, without fully remembering having done it and finished the job. 3 months prior, quietly, she had secured a position as a governess in the north. A contingency, a just in case. She had hoped she would not need it. She picked up the bag. She did not look at the floorboard. She walked out of Asheford Manor without saying goodbye to anyone, because there was no one there to say it to. The children were called Matthew and Rose, and they were 7 and 9 respectively, and they argued about everything with a ferocity that Julie found privately magnificent. She taught them in the mornings arithmetic, history, the fundamentals of clear argument. In the afternoons she read to them by the schoolroom fire while the northern wind pressed flat against the windows, and the countryside beyond went gray and enormous and indifferent. She was good at this. She had always been good at making small spaces feel sufficient. She did not think about the garden. She thought about the garden every single day, the purple-edged sky, the particular quality of his silence, the way he had held her hand as though it were something that mattered beyond the moment. She thought about it the way you think about a door you have closed on yourself, from the outside in the dark, with full knowledge that you were the one who closed it and a complicated pride in having done so. She wrote 11 letters she did not send. She kept them in the box, beside her mother's things, beside the document she still did not know how to use. She told herself she was content. On the better days, she almost believed it. Jack received her note on a Tuesday. He read it standing in the entrance hall, still in his coat, having just returned from an evening he could not have described if pressed. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his breast pocket, which was not where a man places something he intends to discard. He was not, as established, a man who chased. He was, however, a man who had spent enough of his life watching real things be quietly buried by convenient arrangements. His father's will, his mother's wishes, the slow erasure of anything inconvenient from the official record of his family's history. He had learned to recognize the particular shape of suppression. It had a texture, a grammar. It looked like a woman saying, "Please do not look for me," in handwriting that was perfectly steady and therefore cost her something. He hired a solicitor the following morning, not to find Julie, not yet. First, to find the truth she was carrying. The solicitor found the record of Lord Voss's legal filing within 3 weeks not destroyed, as Lady Hartwell had apparently assumed, but misfiled in a county registry office outside Derbyshire, gathering quiet dust beside a collection of similarly displaced documents from the same period. The clerk who had misfiled it had done so, the solicitor suspected, for a fee. The document itself was unambiguous, witnessed, dated, legal in every particular. Then Jack found her. He came without announcement, without letter, without the elaborate social architecture that his position entitled him to deploy. He hired a horse and rode north on a morning when the sky was the color of unpolished silver, and he arrived at the house in the early afternoon and asked the housekeeper simply if he might wait. He waited in the hallway for 20 minutes. He could hear, through the ceiling, the sound of a lesson, a child's voice stumbling through a recitation, a correction offered patiently, the child trying again. He stood very still and listened to her teach someone to try again. When she came downstairs and saw him in the hallway, she stopped on the 3rd step from the bottom. Matthew and Rose pressed in behind her, fascinated. Jack reached into his coat and held up a document, a verified copy, properly sealed. He looked at her steadily across the narrow hallway and said, "You forgot something." Julie looked at the document, then at him, then at the document again. "Children," she said very calmly, "go and find Mrs. Albright. Tell her I said you may have the biscuits." They went with extraordinary speed. She was furious. She told him so, clearly and without performance, standing in the cold hallway with her arms folded, furious that he had looked, that he had found it, that he had ridden north with it, as though the problem were simply one of logistics, as though the law were a sufficient answer to the particular architecture of a life built around her absence. He let her finish. Then he said, "You're right that the document doesn't fix what was done to you. I'm not here because of the document." "Then why?" "Because I fell in love with a woman in a dark corridor who talked about silence like she'd lived inside it. because she disappeared and I spent 3 months learning the shape of what was missing." He paused. "Because you sent me a note asking me not to look, and I am standing here anyway, and I think you deserve to decide what to do with that rather than having the decision made for you again." Julie stood very still. Outside, the northern wind moved across the fields in long, slow waves. "I am not a rescued woman," she said finally. "I know exactly what you are," he said. "That's rather the point." She returned to Asheford Manor on a morning in late summer, alone, without Jack, because she had asked him to let her do this herself, and he had, without argument, agreed. Lady Hartwell received her in the morning room, the same folded hands, the same careful posture of a woman who had never once allowed the surface to betray the interior. For a moment, nothing moved. Julie set the verified document on the table between them. She named her terms: a fair legal settlement, no litigation, no public dispute. In exchange, she would make no claim on the manor itself. She wanted what was owed, not what she could take. There was a profound difference, and she needed Lady Hartwell to understand that she understood it. Lady Hartwell looked at the document for a long time. She said nothing. For the first time in 11 years, she had nothing to say. Julie picked up her gloves and left. They married in early October, small ceremony, morning light, the garden at Ravenswood dressed in the first colors of autumn. The stepsisters attended. Cecilia sat through the ceremony with her hands in her lap, and her eyes fixed at a careful point above Julie's head, the posture of a woman managing something she lacked the vocabulary to name. Her earl sat beside her, correct and distant, a title without warmth. Vivienne's viscount was kind enough, but Vivienne's eyes moved around the room with the restless look of someone who had arrived at a destination and found it smaller than the map suggested. They were countesses. They had everything they had maneuvered for. On the way out, Vivienne caught Julie's hand at the door. She held it for just a moment. Then she leaned in, quiet enough that no one else could hear, and said, "I always thought you were the clever one." Julie looked at her, this woman who had never been unkind, only absent, which was its own variety of damage, and felt something loosen in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, something quieter. The recognition that some people are also trapped in houses not of their own making. "I know," Julie said gently, and she meant it without cruelty. The last afternoon of October was still and golden. Julie sat in the walled garden at Ravenswood, her garden now, though the possessive still felt new in her mouth, with her mother's final letter open across her knees. She had been carrying it for 3 years. She read it through to the last line slowly, without stopping. Her mother had known, had documented everything, had trusted solicitors, had sealed the truth in an envelope addressed to the daughter she hoped would eventually be ready to receive it.